The subcommittee will come to order. Welcome to the first hearing of the Human Resources Subcommittee of the 115th Congress. We have a good mix of new and returning members on the subcommittee this session, and I'm honored to serve as the chairman of this important subcommittee. I'd like to take a moment to introduce the members on our side of the dais: Mr. Smith of Missouri, Ms. Walorski of Indiana, a new member of the Ways and Means Committee, Mr. Reichert of Washington, a past chair of this subcommittee, Mr. Reed of New York, and Mr. Rice of South Carolina. On my left, we have the ranking member for the 115th Congress, Mr. Davis of Illinois. Mr. Davis, would you care to introduce your members of the subcommittee?
I would indeed. Let me first of all, though, thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing in particular. I certainly look forward to working with you, and I think we're going to be a very productive team. I'm honored to serve as the ranking member of this subcommittee, and I'm proud to introduce the following Democratic members of the Human Resources Subcommittee. Mr. Lloyd Doggett of Texas, who has been on the committee and is a senior member of the Ways and Means Committee. And of course, I'm fortunate to be working with two members of this committee and two new members of the Human Resources Subcommittee, Ms. Terry Sewell of Alabama, who represents a vast area that's called rural America. As a matter of fact, much of her district has been called the Black Belt of the South. And Ms. Judy Chu of California, who's not here at the moment, but with whom I've had the opportunity to work on issues as well. So, Mr. Chairman, we are all indeed proud to be here, pleased to work with you and other members of the committee, and look forward to a wonderful time.
Thank you, and likewise. I appreciate the conversations we've already had, and I think some priorities that are certainly timely, and I appreciate the opportunity to work together. It's great to work with all of the members of this subcommittee so that we can help more Americans escape poverty and move up the economic ladder. As we all know, the Ways and Means Committee plays an important role in designing policies to improve the lives of Americans across this country. Together, members of this committee work to improve our nation's healthcare system, modernize our tax code to make American business more competitive, improve trade so U.S. companies can sell goods abroad, and in the Human Resources Subcommittee, help more families access opportunity to move up the economic ladder. This task is more important than ever. While the total number of individuals living in poverty has fallen from its recent peak in 2010, poverty rates, and even more troubling, child poverty rates, remain much higher than they were prior to the recession. In addition, a larger share of working-age adults are in poverty than ever before, as fewer men and women today are employed than in the past. Today's hearing represents our first step to address this issue in the 115th Congress. Before we can identify ways to foster greater opportunities, we have to first understand what the challenges look like across the country. That's why the focus of our hearing today is on the geography of poverty. This felt like the right place to start as I thought about the challenges in my own district, where many locations aren't just rural, but also remote, and that of the ranking members as potential bookends of the same story. People often think of poverty only as they see it in cities, not realizing poverty today is more common than ever in suburban and rural areas. People also underestimate poverty in rural and remote areas, not knowing rates of poverty in these areas have for decades been higher than in urban areas. Our instinct might be to think rural Nebraska and urban Chicago are so vastly different they have nothing in common. But what we are charged to do in this subcommittee is to find ways for individuals and families to succeed, and those challenges are universal, even if they require different solutions. Fortunately, the members of this subcommittee bring substantial expertise to bear, as together we represent a wide range of constituencies from virtually all four corners of this country. This diversity will be an asset as we explore ways to reduce poverty, as I know what works in one area may not always be what works in another. It's important we realize and respect the differences between the constituencies we represent. As too often, Congress proposes national, one-size-fits-all solutions when local flexibility is truly what's needed. Clearly, the centerpiece of any poverty-fighting strategy must be employment. We must make sure federal policies support and reward work and make sure employment pays for those struggling to get ahead. It's also important we get incentives right so everyone benefits when someone moves from welfare to work, from the state agency running the program to the business owner hiring the employee to the individual seeking to improve his or her own life. We should also avoid the tendency to focus solely on inputs like dollars spent or people served, and instead ensure we focus on outcomes. By prioritizing results, we can empower local communities with the flexibility they need to design solutions which have real impact on improving the lives of families in their community. I look forward to hearing from our expert panel of witnesses today, and I know their insights will lay the groundwork for our efforts to help more Americans find jobs, escape poverty, and move up the economic ladder. I now yield to the distinguished ranking member, Mr. Davis, for the purposes of an opening statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and before I begin, let me just thank you for your altering of protocol to allow Ms. Linda Thomas to sit in with her co-worker, and she has done so much work in this area, and it's just wonderful for her to have the opportunity to be here. Poverty and lack of opportunity have consequences, not just for individuals and their families, but also for their communities. 70% of homicides in Chicago occur in just 20 neighborhoods. The poverty rate in these 20 neighborhoods is more than twice as high as the poverty rate nationally, and unemployment is 6 times higher. I see firsthand that low-income Chicagoans desperately want good jobs with wages that support their families. But these workers often lack the education, skills, and training needed to access those quality jobs. If they are returning citizens, they face significant hurdles to employment and supporting their families. Even those who are qualified, there remain job shortages across dozens of industries. A new report found that in 2015, about 43% of black men aged 20 to 24 in Chicago's West Side and South Side neighborhoods were neither working nor in school. At first glance, the poverty I see in Chicago might look different from the struggles Chairman Smith sees at home in rural Nebraska. Although the faces might look different, although the challenges and experiences that brought people down might be different, we have much more in common than we think. Wherever you live, the first step out of poverty is a good job. It sounds simple, but there are a lot of steps needed to make that happen. The research is clear. The first job matters. Good jobs lead to other good jobs. Workers need basic education and a way to acquire the right skills for good jobs, whether that means on-the-job training, a specialized training program, or higher education. They may need an employer who's willing to take a chance on someone who doesn't have much experience or has made mistakes in the past. They need to be reliable employees, and that means they need a way to get to work. If they're parents, they need child care and paid leave so they can work and still care for their families. The federal government has a choice. We can invest in lifting up those communities and those families. We can provide the funding for workforce development so that when we measure program outcomes, the outcomes will be good. We can update the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families program and the Child Support Enforcement program to give parents opportunities to get the skills and credentials that good jobs require. We can make sure working parents have safe, quality child care available during the hours they work. And we can stop insulting people by suggesting work requirements for programs that offer struggling families food or basic health care. Instead, we can acknowledge that parents are trying to support their families, but they can't find jobs, or the jobs they do find don't pay. We need to do everything in the country, from the city streets of Chicago to Chairman Smith's roads. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, I'm honored to serve as the ranking member of this subcommittee. And indeed, we look forward to the continuation of good work. And I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Davis. And without objection, other members' opening statements will be made a part of the record. I'd like to welcome our witnesses to the table here today. We certainly appreciate you sharing your time and expertise and insight as you do share your statements here today. First, we have Mrs. Elizabeth Kneebone, a fellow at the Metropolitan Policy Program at the Brookings Institution. After Elizabeth, we'll have Mr. Mark Partridge, a professor from the Ohio State University. I even said the Ohio State University. Then we'll have Mr. William Levy, the Executive Director, Greater West Town Project in Chicago, Illinois, accompanied later by Linda Thomas, Director of Client Services for the Greater West Town Project. Thank you for being here. And last but not least, certainly, Ms. Tammy Slater, CEO of Goodwill Industries of Greater Nebraska, where she serves 55 counties in Nebraska and operates 8 retail stores, 7 of which are in my district. And I'm not sure all 55 of your counties are in the 75 counties of the 3rd district, but thank you for being here. Thank you all for being here. We're kind of a family here, wanting to know more of your insights and experiences and expertise. So, Ms. Kneebone, please.
Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Davis, and members of the subcommittee, thank you so much for the opportunity to testify today. This morning, I'm going to spend some time giving a brief overview of the changing geography of poverty, including its growth into new and different areas. I'll talk about some of the factors that have led to the shifts we've seen in recent years, some of the challenges that have accompanied those trends, and finally, some of the implications for efforts to effectively address poverty across different kinds of communities. But let's start with the numbers. The 2000s saw poverty grow rapidly in the U.S., and even with the declines we've seen in recent years, by 2015, we still had 43.1 million people living below the federal poverty line, or 13.5% of the population. That's almost 6 million more people than before the recession began in 2007, and 11.5 million more people than in 2000. When we think about poverty in the United States, we often think about it in an urban context or as a rural challenge, because that's where it's historically been concentrated. And as poverty grew in the 2000s, it continued to grow in those places, but it grew at an even faster pace outside of them. So between 2000 and 2015, in big cities and in rural communities, the poor population grew by about 20%. In smaller metropolitan areas, it grew at twice that pace. And the fastest pace of growth actually took place in suburbs of our major metropolitan areas, which saw their poor population grow by 57%. All told, suburbs accounted for about half of the total increase in the nation's poor population over that time period. Now, poverty rates remain higher in cities and in rural communities, but today more poor people live in suburbs. In 2015, 16 million people in suburbs live below the poverty line, 3 million more than in big cities. That's 6 million more than in smaller metropolitan areas, and 8 million more than in rural America. So why has that happened? What caused these historic shifts? Well, in some cases, it's because more poor people moved to the suburbs for any number of reasons, following job opportunities, which continued to suburbanize, shifting trends in where affordable housing is located within regions, or just following the amenities that the suburbs offered. But more so, and an even bigger part of this puzzle, was actually the downward mobility of long-term suburban residents over time. Part of that is because of the 2 economic recessions we saw in the 2000s, particularly the severity of the Great Recession. But it's not just about downturns, it's also about structural changes in the economy that have led to a growing prevalence of low-wage work, and that saw the typical household income fall even before the Great Recession hit. So why does it matter that all of these forces together have pushed poverty up and into more and different places? Partly it's because the places that have seen poverty grow fastest often were not built, nor are they now equipped to deal with the levels of need at which they're seeing today. Many suburbs don't have the kinds of infrastructure like public transit or support services like a robust nonprofit safety net that cities have been able to evolve and develop over decades. And overcoming those gaps is challenged by the fact that suburbs stretch over a really fragmented jurisdictional map. There are several jurisdictions, many of them quite small, that make up the suburbs and are just too small on their own and lack the capacity to marshal responses at the scale of need that they're seeing today. Also, they lack resources, partly because resources have lagged this rapid change in the geography of poverty, both in terms of philanthropic support and in terms of federal and government investments in places. Some of that is because of the lack of capacity in these places. They're not able to compete to effectively bring resources into their communities. Some of it's by design, by the way that these funding sources were designed with different geography of poverty in mind. Clearly, more resources are needed to deal with the scale and reach of need that we see today, but even just marshaling and more effectively using the limited resources we have will require that we get to a more effective scale so we can help more people in more places. There are communities across the country that are already finding ways to do this. Often it's through collaboration, whether it's suburbs coming together to work across suburban jurisdictional boundaries, suburbs working with central cities to address shared challenges, or suburban communities joining with their rural neighbors to work on common issues. All of these sorts of strategies and models share a desire and the effort to get to that better scale, to use these limited resources more effectively and in ways that can help more people in more places, but they are fighting an uphill battle to do that in the current context. So the way that the federal government could be a strong partner here, could align resources more effectively to support these types of strategies and help scale up these types of responses would be, one, to explicitly incentivize collaborative strategies that cut across jurisdictions, that cut across policy silos, that could, number two, catalyze regional capacity to try and help overcome some of these capacity gaps in these communities through these more regionally scaled entities and efforts. And three, finally, allowing for more experimentation and evaluation to show what can work at the regional level and across different types of communities to connect more people and places to opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Kneebone. And I did mention earlier, though, that oral statements are limited to 5 minutes. I appreciate your cooperation there, and certainly all of your written statements will be included in the record. So thank you, Ms. Kneebone. Mr. Partridge, you may begin.
Thank you, Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Davis, and other members. I'm Mark Partridge. My views reflect my research and not those of The Ohio State University. Today I discuss the diversity of rural poverty in rural America and describe ways to reduce poverty and its harmful effects. Much of rural America struggles from low commodity prices and fierce foreign competition, yet portrayals of the death of rural America are misleading. Dating back to the 1970s, net migration in and out of rural America has been about zero with urban America. In reality, there's three rural Americas. It's very diverse. One, fast-growing, high-amenity regions near lakes, oceans, and mountains. Two, metro-adjacent rural communities with access to urban jobs and services. And three, remote or extractive-based communities. Rural America's industrial structure is becoming closer to urban America. So can you show figure one? For example, figure one shows the shift from the farm economy. From 1969 to 2015, the rural farm employment share declined from 15% to 6%. Rural poverty rates are greater than urban rates. 2014 urban and poverty rates were respectively 15% and 18%. But rural poverty receives relatively little attention. One reason is distance from media centers. Another is that it's hidden and rarely concentrated in poor neighborhoods. Poverty greatly declined from 1959 to 1973. Poverty, though, is very geographically persistent. Next figures. Figures 4 and 6 for my written testimony show the 1979 and 2015 county poverty rates for the lower 48 states, and the maps look very similar, is my point. High poverty clusters exist in central Appalachia, the Black Belt, Mississippi Delta, Rio Grande, and western Native American reservations. Children are disproportionately in poverty. 1/4 of rural children and over 1/5 of urban children are afflicted. Fewer opportunities for poor children perpetuate an intergenerational poverty cycle. Rural policy won't succeed by the next election or save every struggling town. Yet two broad approaches are available. First are people-based policies that directly support the poor, including education and training. The second is place-based policies in which poor locales receive more aid. Examples include infrastructure and firm attraction. But promoting prosperous rural communities requires building from within. Communities possess many entrepreneurial and human resources. Research finds the fastest growing U.S. firms exist everywhere from small towns to large cities. Also, higher shares of small businesses and self-employment support faster future growth. Self-employment and other small business multipliers are double those of regular employment. There are many reasons. Small businesses buy more inputs locally. More profits remain local, and small business development promotes a virtuous cycle of promoting even more business formation. The small businesses can be fostered by reducing regulatory compliance costs. Another is to improve small firm financing. Small business programs should be expanded through community colleges and state extension programs. The best predictor of future regional growth is the initial level of education. Yet rural America is less educated. Young, talented adults from the countryside have long been captivated by bright city lights. But rural communities possess many charms: quiet, safe streets, sense of community, and sane lifestyles. Once former rural residents marry and have children, rural life becomes attractive. Thus, attraction efforts should be on enticing families in 30s and 40s back to rural communities. Rural communities can compete by promoting safety, recreation, and a clean environment. Yet good public schools are paramount, not only for the children, but the parents that are attracted by quality schools are much coveted. Deficient rural public services harm the poor. Fortunately, there are low-cost ways to improve service delivery. Governments can provide seed funding for rural counties to share personnel and resources, for example. To build capacity, Congress should fully fund federal, state, regional development organizations and create new ones. For example, the Appalachian Regional Commission, ARC. Yet, poor funding hampers the ARC's efforts. Still, the ARC has accomplished much with modest resources. It provides bridge loans and seed grants for infrastructure and other programs, but it mainly brokers regional collaborations that cannot be done by one poor community. Other policies should be expanded regardless of residence. For one, the Earned Income Tax Credit provides employment incentives. Early childhood education is also valuable, as is workforce training, access to transportation, mental health provision, and childcare. They should be tailored to account for rural differences. Accessibility is problematic, and services are stretched as many communities are struggling economically and are afflicted by drug crises. In sum, with long, steady, patient effort, rural poverty can be greatly reduced, producing tremendous benefits for families, communities, and the American economy. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Partridge. Mr. Levy, you may begin.
Thank you. My name is Bill Levy.
If you want to turn on your microphone there.
Okay.
There we go. Thank you.
My name is Bill Levy. I'm the Executive Director and founder of the Greater Westtown Community Development Project on Chicago's West Side. My agency is very honored to have been asked by Chairman Smith and especially Congressman Davis to testify today to deepen public understanding of the extent and impact of poverty in urban communities and to share our experience using community-based job training to combat poverty at the individual and community level. Our experience has shown us that intensive occupational skills training in partnership with local industry is a highly effective way to get people into quality career track jobs and help them lift themselves out of poverty. I'm very honored to be with Linda Thomas here today, our Director of Client Services. She's here to answer specific questions you have about our program and the challenges we face. Greater Westtown is a community-based economic development initiative dedicated to expanding education and economic opportunity for the low-income, primarily minority community residents of the Greater West Side of Chicago. We achieve that mission by providing comprehensive workforce development and educational services through a model community business partnership strategy that links the employment and training needs of neighborhood job seekers to local economic development efforts and the workforce needs of area companies. Greater Westtown services include occupational skills training in the high-growth industries of woodworking and shipping and receiving, job placement support services, and, very importantly, an alternative high school for youth that have dropped out in our community. Greater Westtown's programs are focused also to help meet the needs of local employers for the skilled and motivated workers they need to stay and grow in the area while competing successfully in the global marketplace. Greater Westtown's target populations include ex-offenders, welfare-eligible single parents, homeless, dislocated workers, high school dropouts, and teen parents. More than 1,800 graduates of the woodworking and shipping and receiving programs have been placed in jobs with area companies. Our targeted community areas have historically been, I'm going to skip this because Danny has covered the poverty in our neighborhood so well. Danny, I couldn't do it any more or any better. I think my only point that I like to make is that there's major racial barriers in the labor market, and we need to admit them and deal with them. Unemployment rates for black men are disproportionately high. In Chicago, black men are twice as likely to be unemployed as Latinos and 3 times as likely to be unemployed as whites. So it might be controversial for you guys, but it's there. If you look at the numbers, it's jumping off the page at us. And of course, a major barrier to finding jobs in our communities, so many ex-offenders come back into our community. Our communities are disproportionately receiving ex-offenders as they leave prison. And of course, our high school dropout crisis is a huge, huge problem and barrier to economic opportunity. Our neighborhood high schools have reported dropout rates of up to 50%. Our occupational skills training is a proven, highly effective model that provides employment opportunities to high-need populations. The program is designed and operated in collaboration with local employer partners. Our employment strategy, a training strategy, combines a bridge program with basic skills remediation, and that leads to a hard skills program, an occupational certificate program. And it's by getting folks into that occupational certificate program that we get them access to higher skilled, higher paid jobs. Okay. Try to simplify all that. Okay. Greater Westtown meets employer needs by providing trained, dependable, motivated workers. And we give employers special value-added labor force development services that the companies cannot provide or undertake on their own. Many local firms credit our programs for their manufacturing success and cite it as an important factor in their decision to remain in Chicago and expand operations. We continually upgrade our instruction with input from our business partners to ensure industry relevance and to make smart investments in cutting-edge technologies and training. Our commitment to support our program participants and ensure their success means that we continually assess participants' needs and provide responses in a timely manner. Recently, Greater Westtown has expanded its focus on networking with other community-based agencies to help provide for fundamental needs such as childcare, housing, transportation, and food security. Greater Westtown services are in more demand than ever, but resources to support our work are shrinking. And I think I'm out of time. So, thank you.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Levy. Ms. Slater.
Good morning. Thank you for the invitation to testify on the challenges and opportunities of serving people in rural Nebraska impacted by poverty. My name is Tammy Slater, and I live in Doniphan, Nebraska, a town of 850-plus people. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of Goodwill Industries of Greater Nebraska, located in the 3rd largest city of Nebraska, Grand Island, with a population of 50,000. We're one of 157 autonomous Goodwill organizations in the United States and one of 4 Goodwills serving Nebraska. Last year, all Goodwills collectively connected 312,000 people with employment in the United States and Canada. Each local Goodwill organization has an assigned territory that provides services with our geographic area in response to the community's needs. Goodwill Industries of Greater Nebraska services promote independence and access to the community, help people become successfully employed, support goals of wellness and recovery, facilitate group classes to teach responsible behavior, and provide safe and affordable housing. Our Goodwill mission is to serve Nebraskans experiencing intellectual or developmental disabilities, severe and persistent mental illness, substance abuse disorder, behavioral health challenges, and acquired brain injury. Each year, we serve more than 1,600 people in central and western Nebraska with an array of services. We help people earn jobs and advance their careers with specialized services to meet their needs. Our service territory, as Chairman Smith referenced, includes 55 counties and is about 54,000 square miles. Of the counties we serve, 30% have a population of 3,000 or fewer. The challenges of poverty, as we all know, are from stable housing, lack of stable housing, adequate nutrition, effective health care, reliable transportation, quality child care, appropriate education, and job training are common to both rural and urban areas. How we respond to these challenges may be different because we do have sparse population, limited local resources, and scarce employment opportunities. Education and job opportunities are scarce, as I said, for people in rural Nebraska, which is a major roadblock to lifting people out of poverty. In 2015, rural employment was still below pre-recession rates, and earnings are generally lower in rural areas than those in urban. Many of the individuals that we serve require comprehensive services. So partnerships with state and local agencies are important to address the complex needs of people living in rural Nebraska. Community partnerships such as our public schools, United Ways, area churches, local Salvation Army posts, help us to build a network in order to help. Government partners in health and human services like corrections, folk rehab, and Social Security, among others, help people living in rural communities get and keep their life on track. Though partnerships are crucial to success, it is tougher in rural areas because there are fewer community organizations, and we struggle to continue services due to the long distance between communities, which are expensive to maintain. We at Goodwill are grateful for our social enterprise that create jobs and help fund services. Our team members work to understand our neighbors in the communities we serve and how we equip them to overcome poverty. One of those neighbors is Peter. When Peter was referred from Nebraska Vocational Rehab to Goodwill, which that's where we get our referrals, he was unemployed. He was diagnosed with bipolar disorder, adjustment disorder with anxiety and depression, and narcissistic personality disorder, and receiving Social Security. Peter was also on probation for a felony, and his employment retention was beyond poor. Peter was able to access an array of services from our Goodwill, including comprehensive benefits planning, behavioral health day services, and our behavioral health employment program. Together with Peter, the team working to support him, including Goodwill staff, the local probation, his counselor at Nebraska VR, and his family members, he's had a great result. He's been employed for over 1 year, continues to work with our behavioral health and benefits planning. Peter is just one example of the complexity of those we serve every day. I thank you for this opportunity to share our experience. We appreciate the subcommittee's interest in hearing from the field and are very happy to serve as a resource. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Slater. Thank you very much to all of our witnesses again for sharing your expertise, and this perspective that I hope we can all share. And we're going to go down the line here and with the question and answer and just describe our districts a little bit. And obviously, I mentioned earlier that we have rural parts of America and remote parts. And obviously, if someone has a commute in the city for various reasons, there can be significant commutes in rural and remote America as well. Sometimes I describe parts of my district in terms of the distance from a Walmart, maybe even a McDonald's, and it runs in the hours. And so it can be very different, and yet when it boils down to it, many of the needs are similar to even that of the inner city. And of course, sometimes the commute times of city life would have something that no one in rural America would want to tolerate, but I think that hopefully we'll see programs, though, with flexibility and intent to help people in a very authentic way. But Ms. Slater, again, thanks for being here and certainly describing the district and your work and sharing some of the stories that you did, and certainly some of the clients you serve. And it can be obviously challenging to address poverty and the economic needs of the many communities across our district because of distances, even from organizations like yours, even though you're pretty well spread out across the district. Although our unemployment rate is lower and high school graduation is higher than in many states, I know there are still many people struggling to find work and make ends meet. I especially appreciate the story you tell about Peter in your testimony, and how by coordinating services and helping him set goals, he has been able to overcome some of the difficulties he has faced, and now has been employed for over a year. At the federal level, we are thinking about ways to provide more flexibility coupled with strong accountability to make sure your organization and those like it can customize services and benefits so you can help more people like Peter succeed in the workforce. As we think about our efforts, what should we make sure you are able to do or do more of for you to be successful as an organization? What are some of the key factors in what you do which helped Peter be successful, find a job, and stay employed? Ms. Slater?
Chairman Smith, when I think about that question, the most important thing is it's not just one service. When I talked about the variety of services that we offer at Goodwill, getting a job, yes, is the main focus because we all know that a job gives us purpose in life. But it's the whole package. Again, someone has to, first of all, be able to understand and know what their barriers are and how can we help them. If I think about Peter with a mental illness, again, being able to have people understand that illness and how do they now learn to cope with that disease, whatever that may be. Then once they understand that, what also is important is giving them structure to their life. Because again, now that they have this barrier or a mental illness to deal with, the structure of how to cope with that, how important medication is. But then also, how do we then teach them possibly new skills, or for them to understand what their skill set or abilities are, and how do we help them understand that to then match them with a proper job. Then the other challenge becomes partnering with employers, because we all know, you hear it across the United States every day, it's tough to find employees. But again, if we're then bringing someone forward as a potential employee, what is their openness to work with someone that may have some special needs or a mental illness or other barriers that make it possibly more difficult for them? It has to be collaboration. I hope that was strong in my message. It's not just one of any of us. It's all of us coming together and making sure we understand what each of us bring to the table. So Chairman Smith, the first answer would be flexibility to be able to reach out to the proper services that will meet that individual's needs.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Kneebone, would you be able to reflect on this at all, given your insight?
Just to echo what Ms. Slater said, with the flexibility being key, especially as you see some of the most effective models being ones that are able to bring multiple programs together, multiple partners to the table. That also often brings with it a big administrative burden, a lot of red tape that puts a strain on the providers and takes resources from the actual mission. So I think the ability to allow for more experimentation and figure out how, with accountability, we can allow for more flexible strategies that work over different kinds of communities, that would be key.
All right, very, very well. Thank you. I now recognize our distinguished ranking member, Mr. Davis, for questions he might have.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I thank all of you who have come to share with us this morning. Each one of you talked about a lack of local resources for addressing some of the key challenges of poverty, skill building, support like child care, health care, transportation, and housing. Could targeted federal investment make a real difference in the kind of communities you have studied? Perhaps, Ms. Slater, I'll start with you.
Yes, I believe so, because again, the federal support directs how it trickles down to the state and the region. So again, if it's back to the flexibility and really acknowledging the lack of services in some of the areas.
Ms. Levy?
Danny, I think for us, we've been through a lot of iterations of different job training. We've been around since CETA practically. You know, Job Training and Partnership Act, Welfare to Work Act, the American Recovery Act. So, but the point is that most of these programs don't really allow you to do the intensive kind of training we actually do. We may have to cobble together resources from a whole bunch of places to get enough money to get the basic skills remediation, to get the work maturity training, and this very expensive occupational skills training, where our shop, you've been there, I mean, this is an expensive operation, but it gets people real skills, and people can really get quality jobs and get a foothold on a career ladder. It's an investment that is not being made and needs to be made. And it's, so again, in the old days, Job Training Partnership Act used to train tons of African-American men in Chicago for jobs in the city. That's almost was all wiped out. And we went to a voucher-based system with WIA. So again, we need to put some of the money in job training that we used to have during CETA days. And we used to make a real commitment to skill training and lifting people out of poverty. It can be done. I mean, we're a model, and it can be done. And Linda and I do it. But we need much more consistent resource and commitment to training, comprehensive training, and getting industry, and I'm talking too much. Okay, I'll be quiet. Okay. I'm talking too much.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Davis. I think the answer is yes, and I think they described it well. One of the things, though, I want to point out is especially in rural communities, but even in urban communities, is there's a lot of these scattered programs and duplicate services and all sorts of issues. And so that was one of the reasons why in my testimony I discussed expanding regional, state, federal development organizations like the Appalachian Regional Commission. They exist on paper, like in Ms. Sewell's district, but it doesn't have any, I don't think there's any resources. And so what they would do is they have, like the Appalachian Regional Commission only has a $100 to $150 million budget. However, they're fantastic at being the broker who leads the efforts that brings everybody to the table to help with the collaboration that the previous two spoke about that is needed for this. So that's one of the, I think that'd be one of the ways that a relatively small amount of money could have a lot of payoff.
Thank you.
I think that point really speaks to addressing the capacity issue, because targeted federal investment absolutely could make a big difference in these places, especially if it embraces these more holistic, cross-cutting strategies that recognize the complexities that are facing poor people and poor communities. But if we want that funding to be able to reach into some of these communities we're talking about and places where poverty has grown rapidly more recently, we have to overcome that capacity gap. And having these quarterback-type institutions that can play that role and more effectively marshal all those resources is a critical step. So any sort of funding, I think, should explicitly recognize and target resources to that type of backbone capacity building and that sort of entity.
Thank you. And quickly, Mr. Levy, I've always been intrigued by your ability to work directly with local employers where you know that you're training people for what they need. How did you accomplish that?
We're not going to do a lot of history. I mean, we understood that race was a big variable. And on the old west side of Chicago, where my dad worked, you know, and he worked at a manufacturing company, and he lived in a neighborhood, took the bus, blah, blah, blah. When that neighborhood changed to African American, those local companies had extreme difficulty in absorbing and training the local workforce. And we could see it 20 years later. So we went to partner with the Industrial Council of Near West Chicago, and these were our local employers. We said, let's work together, let's create a program that's going to open the doors for our community residents, brown and black, and it's going to get you the workers you need. And we actually sat down and planned the bloody thing with our neighborhood small businesses in woodworking and shipping and receiving with the help of the Industrial Council. The key to that was the employers had some sense of ownership and involvement, and employers got to meet our community people during training. They got to see their dedication. They got to see the quality of our people, and racial stereotypes were overcome, attitudes for ex-offenders were overcome. Employers were meeting, and they were setting the standards for training, so they owned it. It's way more than just, you know, I have a company that I'm going to take a job order from and fill. No, these guys were involved, and they owned the program design, and they owned its success. And you probably heard from them. We got our funding cut, and these employers, they went to the mat for us. So they own this thing, and they're 99% white small business owners from the industrial corridor. And it's great when our participants go on a field trip, a tour to a local company. They go in and look at whatever the company, and they see, oh, there's my neighbor working, there's my... So they get the confidence that these guys are giving our people, black people, a fair shake and some opportunity. And conversely, the small business owner sees the hard work, the diligence of our trainees. And of course, the credibility of our staff and the training institution itself kind of brings the community and the business together. These guys have been doing this for 25 years, and they've got quite a reputation in the employer community.
Very good. Thank you. Thank you for your answers there. Now we'll go to Mr. Smith of Missouri.
Thank you, Chairman Smith. It's an honor to serve on your committee, and I like the ring of Chairman Smith, by the way. I want to thank the panel for being here today. In fact, these issues are extremely important. I've spoken with the chairman and the members of this committee of my personal background and interest in poverty. I grew up in a very working class family, and I represent an area in south central Missouri, which is part of the Mississippi Delta. And we have some very interesting dynamics of our own that we deal with. It's the largest congressional district in the state of Missouri, just under 30 counties. It's roughly 20,000 square miles, so it's very rural. Our largest populated community is a town of 38,000 people, Cape Girardeau, Missouri. And I want to give you some interesting statistics about our congressional district. According to the Economic Innovation Group, I represent the 14th most economically distressed congressional district in the country out of 436. 14 out of 436, which is absolutely not good. It's also one of the most conservative congressional districts in the country. The Economic Innovation Group report on distressed communities estimates that 49% of adults in my district are not in the labor force, and the poverty rate is 20%. These numbers are not much different than the city of St. Louis. In St. Louis, 42% of adults are not in the labor force, and poverty rate stands around 22%. So we have more people out of the workforce in our district than the city of St. Louis. And that's much different, though, Ms. Kneebone. According to your testimony, I think these are interesting facts for the state of Missouri. The picture is really different in the suburbs of St. Louis. Just 6 miles from the city of St. Louis, it's 36% of adults who aren't working, and the poverty rate is only 6%. The city of St. Louis, the poverty rate is 22%. In my rural congressional district, it's 20%. All that, in my opinion, says that rural southeast and south central Missouri experiences poverty in similar numbers to the city of St. Louis, and both are far worse than the suburbs of St. Louis, which the poverty rate is 6%. We know that employment is the single largest determining indicator of poverty, but we continue to see factories close for the last several years. In many cases, we see our good-paying factory jobs go overseas because of economic hardships and burdensome regulations. These factories can't keep their doors open, and that means that we're losing good jobs. We had one employer in Butler County, Missouri, in my first year in office that cited that the reason that they were shutting down their doors and eliminating roughly 500 jobs was because of unnecessary and burdensome regulations that they couldn't comply with, and was moving to Mexico. This is a real problem and something that has to be changed. When nearly half of adults in my district aren't working and are out of the labor force entirely, our communities are deeply in trouble. Mr. Partridge, with many rural areas declining in population, who is staying behind? Are these areas becoming wealthier as those who remain have good jobs and choose to stay, or are they becoming poorer as those without means are unable to leave?
Thank you, Mr. Smith. I think the answer to that question is it depends. Because if we're talking about rural district, very, very, very rural districts where people left, what's left behind is often relatively wealthy farmers that are very big. So in that sense, then you have other districts where you have brain drain, where the talented people leave, and that leaves behind a workforce that's less educated, and it's just going to be less dynamic, going to be less business formation and so forth. So it really depends on the setting. There's just a lot of diversity.
So just a lot of barometers and issues. You've been doing a lot to improve the economies of rural areas. Could you give us some examples of what maybe you've done for people in their 30s and 40s to help grow the economy in rural areas?
Well, what I've done is I've tried to point out that when people, especially in the last 15 years, it's been a lot of emphasis on attracting young people with really cool downtowns and so forth. And rural communities can't compete on that. They're just not going to do very well on that basis. However, they can compete on being family friendly and having a really nice environment and lifestyle for certain people. So in that sense, people in their 30s and 40s are no longer looking for cool bars. They're looking for a place to send their kids and be safe. That's where rural communities can thrive.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. And next, we have, yes, Ms. Sewell, sorry, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, panelists. This is the first subcommittee hearing as a new member of Ways and Means that I get to participate in, and I have to tell you that I'm very excited, Chairman Smith and Ranking Member Davis, about the opportunity to be on this subcommittee. My district is the 7th Congressional District of Alabama. I grew up in this district. It's a district that includes the city of Birmingham, which is the largest city in the state of Alabama, but it also includes Selma, Alabama, which is my hometown, and many rural communities around Selma. The median income for a family of 4 in my district is $34,000, and 22% of the families in my district live in poverty. It's affectionately called the Black Belt of Alabama because of the very rich soil that used to be very agrarian and agricultural. It's where a lot of the cotton belt of Alabama back in the day used to exist. Now it is filled with a lot of rural communities that are struggling. I often say that what we lack in the 7th Congressional District in terms of economic prosperity, we more than make up for in heart and fight, in spirit. What we need are better opportunities, more resources, a hand up, not a hand out. Having said that, I was very intrigued by what you were talking about, Mr. Partridge, in terms of regional collaboration. The Appalachian Regional Commission, which you cited, has done some great work across the 13 states that it encompasses with relatively limited resources when you think about the fact that they have to deal with 13 states. In fact, my district doesn't get a lot of resources from ARC. Many of the collaborative regional resources that we receive come from the Delta Regional Authority, which has a very limited budget. It's 1/10 of what ARC is, yet it is literally the lifeline for so many of the communities I represent. Can you talk a little bit about the regional collaboration and what we can do as lawmakers that are not in the position of providing, appropriating dollars, but rather authorization of different social net programs that can be effective in reaching communities like so many of us represent?
Thank you, Ms. Sewell. I think you really described a lot of the issues well. So you get down in the central southern rural Alabama, you have a lot of counties, they lack resources. There's many disparate federal, Economic Development Administration, USDA Rural Development. I mean, all Department of Labor workforce training and so on, all these disparate groups, and these counties just lack things like even an economic development coordinator or one without a lot of training who knows how to write these very complex grants. And so that is one of the key things that ARC has done, is it's a federal state, so it's flexible, it isn't one size fits all. But they're really kind of a leader, and they have like how to do grant writing, to bringing all these disparate counties together to work collaboratively, because if you get jobs in one county, people commute and take them, it helps the whole region. So in that sense, what I view these organizations as doing is they're the broker. They're the ones who can bring everybody to the table with relatively modest resources.
What do you suggest we would do on the authorization side when it comes to workforce development? I'd like to get you, Mr. Levy, involved as well. One of my passions is workforce development, because here's what I know for a fact. So many of the folks that I represent want better opportunities. They want jobs. The problem is finding those jobs. In rural America, a lot of those manufacturing opportunities have really dried up. And so when you finally do get an opportunity, people haven't worked in those manufactured for generations. My biggest example is Wilcox County, which is the poorest county in the state of Alabama. It's in my district, and I'm the only Democrat in Alabama, but I have very good working relationships with my Republican colleagues, and we were able to convince the governor to give us a $150 million manufacturing opportunity in the poorest part of my district. It's a copper manufacturing facility. Here's the problem. We're now busing in people from other communities, Tuscaloosa, to come and take these jobs because we've had generations of people who haven't had opportunity to work. Now, given this great opportunity, how do we bring folks up to speed when it comes to workforce development?
Okay, we'll take a shot at that. What happens is when people are out of the workforce for a long time and they don't trust the employers, they don't trust the system, they're kind of hanging back, they're not willing to make the effort to see because they're afraid to fail. So you got to get them started in baby steps, and you got to have institutions that can engage them credibly. And if they engage and if they believe in the training institutions and they start putting forth the effort, then you can see these folks can learn just like anybody else can learn. Okay, so we call it work ethics. Okay, and we train for it on the shop floor every day. I mean, her Linda's shop is a workplace, and you got to come on time, and you got to respect your fellow workers, and you got to follow the boss's instructions. So you get work ethics training every day on the job, and that's an essential part of getting people to understand that this can work for them. Okay, and getting used to the workplace disciplines. So you got the workplace disciplines, you got basic skills remediation, and then people say, "Oh, hey, if you pass this, if you do that, oh, you're going to get to run that machine, you're going to drive that forklift." People can see progress. Okay, yeah, and these folks can learn it. They need to get motivated and believe it's possible for them.
Chairman Smith, thank you so much for allowing him to answer that question. I think it just goes to the need that we can try to explore in this committee workforce development strategies that will work across the board for suburbia, for people dealing with poverty issues in suburbia, in urban, and in rural.
Right,
Thank you, sir.
absolutely, and certainly for the answers to the questions, that's very relevant. Ms. Walorski.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and again, thank you for holding this important hearing. I am absolutely passionate about this issue, and I'm so glad each of you are here. This is, my district is northern Indiana, and so we're 2 hours from Chicago, and have in the past on some other committees I've been on looked at best practices and places and things that are happening in Chicago that really are, I think, a standard right now of where we're looking. I want to give a shout out to our Goodwill in Indiana, Goodwill Industries, and what they've done in our district, our state, and as they've been able to, to hone in on this issue of collaboration, which I want to come back, Ms. Slater, in a second and talk about that. I think it's incredible that all of your research, all of your findings, and other experts that we've had speak to Congress over the last couple of years, it is so apparent to me that all the work that we're doing, when we look at traditional approaches from government, which has been increased funding, and when you start looking at the numbers of people in poverty, where they're coming from, where they're moving from, it just becomes so important in my mind to do the kinds of things you're talking about, which is connecting people to this equation. It still takes people on the front lines to coordinate. It takes people on the front lines to be able to honor human dignity and to make sure that we're looking at all the seed of the problem and we're actually doing something to make sure that there is an economic ladder out of poverty in this country, the greatest country on the face of the earth. And I am so convinced that the solutions to our very problems are right here within the kinds of research that you've all done and the kind of things that you've moved along, that we're moving the dignity of people along as well, that we're equipping a nation, we're doing it using each other in collaboration. And I think, Ms. Slater, to your point, my district is very much a case study like what you're talking about in Nebraska. I'm 2 hours from Chicago. We're urban, we're rural. We have all the same kind of makeup that, a lot of these small rural areas are. I'm terrified that if we don't come together and fix this in a bipartisan way, that rural America will not recover, and that we're going to be groping for bigger issues later if we don't come together and solve this now. But I'm so convinced about this issue of collaboration, and I'm working on a bill right now for as we approach TANF. Can you just talk about some of the best practices that you've used in your community to collaborate on the front line, and why that is going to be important as we look at, tangible assistance to needy families in the real quick future here?
Sure, thank you very much. Truly, the thing that comes to mind that you just summarized is it's about people. It's about people working together that are there to actually serve the people we are seeing every day. And so truly it becomes, and I think it's one of the advantages maybe of the rural community is we know each other. It's asking for help. It's actually acknowledging what your core is and what cores come from other agencies. The other thing that I think is a plus in the rural community, but not unique, is the fact that if there is an individual with a barrier in a small community, everybody in town knows that. They talk about it. They know Tammy at Goodwill, and they'll call and see if we can be of assistance. But it's really about the whole relationship and trying not to make it the competition that sometimes it becomes, but what are we really good at? And that's one of our best practices, is we have a lot of diverse programs, but at the end of the day, what are we the best at? So if something else comes along, we've learned to say no and to extend a hand and offer something that we may know about to someone else. Because you
That's
cannot be
incredible.
good at
Yeah,
everything.
Absolutely, and that's a great point. I just have a question for all of you in this last minute here, but one of the things in my community that is a plus, both on the rural and the urban side, is the benevolence of my community and the private dollars in regional coordination that are beginning to flow into our own community from our own people. Private dollars, community foundations that are really understanding this. I guess, Mr. Partridge, let me just address that to you with your research. Do you see that emerging now in this country where we're looking at partnerships even financially, so it's not just a one look at a government, but we're looking at resources inside our communities as well?
I think he exactly described it right, in the sense that a lot of this has been promoted, attempts for collaboration have been promoted by just things haven't been working, and a lot of it is problems are lots bigger than what one community can handle. However, at the community level, as you suggested, I mean, the best way is every community has great resources. They have entrepreneurship that's untapped. They have human resources that's untapped. And as I noted in my testimony, just the multiplier effects of new jobs created, spillovers from small business creation and local entrepreneurship are just rather remarkable. And so in that sense, building from within is I think, the best strategy, and the kind of collaboration you're talking about is the way to go.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your indulgence.
Thank you. And next, we have Mr. Riker.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for the hard work that you do. And it's sort of seems removed just a little bit as we're in this formal setting from the reality of the topic that we're discussing, doesn't it? I always sort of get overwhelmed by that thought, but I was thinking back to one of the first hearings that I had when I was chairman and working with Mr. Davis as the ranking member, and I shared my story. There's a lot of stories here, and you have a lot of stories out there in the audience today too, listening. And as I shared my story after the hearing, Mr. Davis said to me, you and I could have grown up in the same neighborhood. And sometimes we forget that we all come from different places. We all come from areas in our life where we struggle. And Sandra Collins was one of those people from the Goodwill Industry Organization in the Seattle area. She testified not too long ago when I was the chairman of the subcommittee. What a success story for Sandra. Sandra was homeless. She had 2 teenage daughters, and was addicted to meth. She had a criminal background. She had no high school diploma, did not have a driver's license when she first connected with the Goodwill. But as she was giving her testimony, she got news that she was just about to be promoted to supervisor. So Sandra is still working at the Goodwill in the Seattle area and is now the manager. So we're proud of her and proud of the work that Goodwill Industries does all across the country, and we need every one of your efforts. So Ms. Sewell was concerned about people coming into the populated areas and taking jobs, and I'm concerned about some of the rural areas having the opportunity to come into those areas and get jobs. So, but we have to balance that, I know, and I wanted to ask Mr. Partridge, are there any programs that, you know, because sometimes people have to make those decisions to relocate, to find a job. What are we looking at as far as programs to help people relocate, not necessarily take all the jobs, but to participate in the workforce?
Well, thank you for the question, Mr. Reichert. I think you really hit upon a really important issue, is that in the past, the key way that Americans did economic opportunity, reached it, was by migration. We were probably the most mobile society in the world for generations. And in the last generation, that's really changed. Young Americans are much less mobile than before. So one of the ways that poverty can be reduced is taking people from places that there are lack of opportunities and moving them to places where there are opportunities. And one of the problems is they're relatively poor. They lack resources for that. They don't have a network, to find a job. Their skills might have been okay for where they're at, but they're not necessarily good in an urban environment. So I would encourage efforts to, at least in a pilot basis, to try to look at helping migration of workers to where there's more opportunities. However, it's just a little bit more complex and saying, here's some money, go move, because of these other issues about the lack of job networks and the lack of training for the kind of jobs that would exist in urban areas.
Great, thank you. Mr. Levy, I wanted to touch on one of your comments as you rolled off the statistics about unemployment between black men, Hispanics, and Caucasians, and I was reading your statement, and you used the word controversial in your comments, but it's not used in your statement, and I don't see anything controversial about it. I just wanted to point that out. And because people are people, in my opinion, and we're here to help. So let me just further state very quickly that I think it's sad that the 50% dropout rate, I mean, that's just an unacceptable number, and I think that's one of the things we have to address. I'm an old cop, 33 years on the streets in Kane County. I worked with people on the street in drug addiction, alcohol, homeless, all the time. One of the things we need to do, and I'm very high on prevention, what do we need to do to get these young people to graduate so they don't start already behind the curve?
Oh, well, we started an alternative high school for dropouts in Chicago because the dropout rates were so severe.
But it's still 50%.
Yeah.
What we need to do a lot more.
They have been. It has been. I use the terms schools had and are still reporting. Neighborhood schools had and are still reporting. The dropout rate in Chicago has improved a little bit. Okay, I'll give you that. And there's been a lot of intervention on dropouts and special programs for dropouts, that some of which reasonably work in this city. So we're a lot better on the dropout front than we were 10 years ago, and we did a lot of research on that and got some bills passed with Senator Del Valle at the state level to deal with the re-enrollment of dropouts. So there was a commission in Illinois for the re-enrollment of dropouts, and we got the issue in the public attention, and so we've made some serious progress. There's still tons of at-risk kids, and we run an alternative school in the heart of the West Side, and our kids are pretty alienated sometimes and pretty tough, and putting together, again, the programs that can engage them and discipline them and challenge them is a hell of a lot.
I'd like to engage further with him at a later time. Mr. Chairman, my time has expired. I yield back.
Thank you. Ms. Chu.
Thank you, Chairman Smith. I represent a very urban, suburban district in Los Angeles County, which has 10 million people. And Mr. Levy, the work that you do is in an area that's very similar to this. In LA County, we have a very, very large homeless population. In fact, the most recent count revealed that there are approximately 43,000 homeless individuals living in shelters or in the streets. Now, you've done a lot of work with similar urban, suburban populations in Chicago. How could federal anti-poverty programs best assist homeless populations in places like LA County and Chicago?
I'm trying to get Linda to talk. She's the expert, and she provides all the intensive support services to the very high-need folks. And we have, what do we say, 22% homeless and near homeless in the training program. Stuff that we transitional for the homeless. Tell a little bit about the transitional works and how it helps the homeless.
So we've, through our city dollars, have come across what we call transitional jobs training funding, where we can work with our clients to provide additional services. We try to help our customers become self-sufficient and to be able to attend training without worries. And so we are able to create jobs within the program and give them a weekly stipend to support them with their needs. We're able to address their ability to secure housing and their ability to get to training and their ability to have clothing and doctor's appointments so that they will have a positive outcome through our transitional jobs training funding.
So for this homeless population, what elements of what you've talked about are the most important? For instance, how important is accessibility to quality housing?
Because for the homeless population, if I don't have secured housing, I will not be well in the job. Before I can take on employment, I have to make sure I have secure housing. I have to make sure that I have transportation to get to that job every day. So when they're in the training program, we're going to immediately on day one start to look at those resources that are out there to make sure this person will have secure housing, that they're going, because we have a lot of people, they're homeless with a roof. So they're going to a cousin's house today, they're staying with a friend tomorrow. And so we're going to work with an agency that's going to help them move into housing where it's secure. So when I start my new job, I can go to work not worrying about where am I going to live tomorrow, or will I get back to the shelter in time to get a bed. So those are the ways that we work strongly to help out with the homelessness for housing.
Yeah, in fact, to follow up, in LA County, we have higher income neighborhoods located right next to low income and poor neighborhoods. And in fact, poverty is found in pockets and separated oftentimes just simply by a neighborhood. So how did we get into this situation, and how could we reduce this inequality between the neighborhoods that are located right next to each other?
I'm going to shoot on that. Wow. Danny knows, you got the west side Austin and you got Oak Park, and you got a serious dividing line. Oak Park is a pretty liberal, progressive place, and they have PADS programs, and they try to keep themselves accessible to the low-income folks in the city. I'm not sure how you integrate across those barriers. It's a voluntary thing in Oak Park. I live in Oak Park, and they're just very progressive folks out there. In terms of your question, how do you create cooperation across community boundaries, neighborhood boundaries? I mean, Chicago is extremely racially segregated, and you have neighborhoods on the south and west side that folks on the north side will not go in. And you have pockets of wealth and affluence on the north side. And you need community development. Most of our development resources traditionally are, I talk about it in my longer thing, you talk about triage. You're putting resources for those most likely to succeed. You're not making the investments in the high-risk areas, in the high poverty areas where you got multi-generational poverty. I mean, everybody wants to pick a winner, and everybody's afraid to waste money on what might be a loser. And again, this is an attitude that, you know, we see in job training, we see in education, we see across the board, we see in housing and urban development sometimes. So this is an attitude, this triage attitude is something that we really have to get our head around and fight against, because we're just, you know, what's happening in our training programs, because the labor market's improving and some people are moving ahead and some people are getting jobs, but those left behind are really desperate, are really sinking. Okay, that's the problem. We're separating more. You talk about income inequality, we talk about it, you know, on the cosmic scale when Bill Gates and those guys have all the money, but it also happens in our communities. We're segregating the rich and the poor even more. You know, Danny, we figure out how to fix that. Clearly, jobs are part of that, and people investing in jobs for low-income people is clearly a part of that solution. Again, I think there's more economic development issues involved here than we've got. And I'm prepared to mouth off about right now.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. Mr. Rice.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Interesting hearing. It seems to me that the way you deal with poverty is you have to do what you can to make sure people have opportunity on the one hand, and then on the other hand, you have to do what you can to make sure they take advantage of that opportunity. And it seems like mostly today we're talking about the second part of that equation, trying to get people to take advantage of opportunities that they have. My district, I got 7 counties in South Carolina. Got Myrtle Beach, big popular tourist destination, and employment rates are pretty low there, but you go inland and I've got 3 of the top 10 poorest counties in the state. They were very agrarian and textiles, tobacco and textiles. So you can guess what's happened to them in the last 40 years, right? Agriculture doesn't employ as many people, and certainly not tobacco. Tobacco's a fraction of what it used to be, and textiles, those jobs are all gone. There are a lot of empty factories in Marion County, South Carolina. So on the one hand, you know, the first part of the equation, trying to do what you can to make sure people have opportunity, and we hadn't talked much about that today, but things like tax reform, regulatory reform that Jason Smith was talking about earlier are so important. And a lot of the reasons why a lot of these companies that used to be in Marion County have left. And I put that on Washington, D.C. And that's why I'm so very happy that this committee is now working on tax reform and the House is working on regulatory reform, because I think the first part of that equation, I mean, you can train people all you want to, but if there's no jobs available when they get out, it doesn't help very much, does it, Mr. Levy? So that, I mean, you gotta get them.
Believe it or not, a trained workforce can be an incentive for a company to come into an area.
That's true. That's another part of it. You know, there's a program in the Florence Darlington Technical College. They have a program for computerized digital machining, and they can take 80 kids a year, and it's a 2-year program. And they got 2 problems. One, they can't get 50 kids a year to sign up for it. And 2, if they do get them to sign up for it, most of them don't finish. They get through 1 year. Well, the reason they don't finish is because the companies are so hungry for these kids that they hire them before they finish their program. Wow. So in other words, we've got this opportunity, but we can't get people to take advantage of the opportunity. And I believe most people would rather work than be on government programs. I think the government, if you rely on the government to provide for your livelihood, you will always live in poverty. I think the government is incapable of providing for you. But we've got 80 different means-tested government programs, many of which are designed to help people to move to work, to move to take care of, and they're not working for a large number of people. There are still significant numbers of people who would rather be on government programs than actually go out and take that computerized digital machining class and go to work and make $60,000 a year. How do you fix that, Mr. Levy?
Well, I mean, we deal with it every day, okay? Opportunity plus effort equals success, okay? People gotta make the effort to take advantage of the opportunities presented to them. And do they see and believe, and is the opportunity real for them? Their perceptions are a lot, and I live in this every day. In Linda's program, she's able to get and engage and discipline her people, and the people are enthusiastic, and she has credibility and trust, and the people march through the program and they go out in the labor market, and they do well, okay? Now, and my high school used to be that way, but it's not that so much anymore. In our high school, Westtown Academy, we're having an issue of student engagement and motivation.
Okay, I need you to wind down because I want to ask somebody else too.
What's that?
I want to ask somebody else too, so wind up if you
I'll,
can.
I'll tell you about the Westtown Academy some other day, but you know, it's a question of credibility and trust. And are they perceiving this thing as really working? Are they believing it? And if they believe in the leadership of that school can discipline them, can draw them out, can challenge them, okay? And they will see it as benefit to them in their lives. They gotta have credibility with those kids, and you can get them to do what they need to do.
Mr. Partridge, how do you get them to take advantage of the opportunity?
Thank you. I think one of the things that I've always thought about poverty and is that not only do we have to train workers, and in places where there's a lot of high poverty, there has to be also the opportunity, so the person has the incentive to go for 2 years through a training program so they can get a job. And so in that sense, it is a chicken egg problem that, you know, there has to be jobs to have incentives for people to get the training so that they could actually get a job. So you're absolutely right. It is a chicken egg issue. And one of the things that you raised is the general macroeconomic environment has not been very favorable for the lower half of the income distribution. And any efforts there, manufacturing was an old mainstay for that group. And any efforts there to build up that part of the economy I think would have very large positive effects.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Rice. Mr. Corbello.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much for holding this hearing. I think you always hear politicians talk about the middle class, and indeed the middle class is important. It's the engine of the American economy, but that's also where most of the votes happen to be. In poor communities, there aren't as many votes, yet we're here because you care about this issue, Mr. Chairman. We care about this issue, and certainly our witnesses do, so I thank you all for coming. Ms. Kneebone, I want to talk to you about suburban poverty. I represent a largely suburban district, and you discussed the migration of poverty from the urban cores out into the suburbs, and of course, this is a major concern for me. I think one of the aggravators or the factors that contribute to this phenomenon is the lack of transportation out in the suburbs. Most urban cores have fairly sophisticated public transportation grids, but as low-income individuals move from the urban cores out to the suburbs, does that lack of access to public transportation aggravate their circumstances?
That's a real challenge for suburban communities across the country, particularly for the poor residents, because as both jobs have shifted away from downtown and poverty has grown more in suburbs, those aren't often happening in the same places. So the distance between where jobs are located and where poor people can afford to live has grown. And we've seen the number of nearby jobs for poor residents fall across the country in urban, suburban, and rural communities. So that the fact that suburbs often don't have public transit systems, or when they do, they're not connected suburb to suburb where a lot of these job opportunities are growing, does exacerbate that mismatch. It makes it much harder to connect to those employment opportunities that can give them a path out of poverty, and also makes it more incumbent on them to have to own a car and have to deal with the high costs of maintaining a reliable car that would actually be able to get them to where the job opportunities are.
So given that infrastructure investment is a priority for the new administration and for many of us here in Congress, you think there is an opportunity to use some of that poverty data to more effectively make these investments?
Yes, absolutely, both in terms of how we think about where to make transportation investments in terms of roads versus transit options, where those dollars go, how they're deployed, but also in terms of thinking about where housing is around those networks, where we can take advantage of density around those transit hubs to increase access to opportunity both through affordable housing and through transportation.
Thank you. Dr. Partridge, I should get you on the record about the great theft of 2003 when the Ohio State University robbed the University of Miami of a college football championship. By the way, Mr. Chairman, the year before we defeated Nebraska in Pasadena, but let's set that aside because there's very little time. I do want to ask you about education. And we have built this idea in our society that every young person has to go get a four-year degree at a traditional university like the Ohio State University, like the University of Miami. And in many ways, our tax code supports that idea. Do you think that the lack of an acknowledgement of the diverse paths that there are to success, to getting educated, to acquiring the skills needed to obtain a quality job, that the lack of recognition is aggravating poverty in a lot of communities?
Thank you for the question. In some cases, yes, that there's a segment of the high school population that just is unaware of the opportunities. And you're right, many high school curriculums look like a pre-college training program, and so there's fewer of those opportunities. I think, besides curriculum reform and providing better information to students, that's one of the things that the economists found. If you give the students information, they'll make better decisions. Besides that, is one of the areas I think is just fantastic in terms of investment. And in terms of the role they play in communities and broader communities is community colleges and technical colleges. They're on the ground doing the workforce training. But even beyond that, they have more of a regional footprint that brings people together in the collaborative processes. So in that sense, investment in technical colleges and community colleges would have a large payoff for the kind of the population that we're talking about.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. Again, thank you to all of our members here today, and certainly to our witnesses. Your expertise is valuable, and we could probably extend this for a few more hours just in discussion. But with that being said, though, you will have the opportunity to extend your remarks for the record. The record will be held open for 2 weeks. And so if you wish to respond in more depth to some of these questions, you'll have the opportunity to do so. And with that, I say thanks again, and the committee stands adjourned.
Very good.
Thank you.
I was a little bit wide. I was a little bit wide of the mark.